Welcome to a special one-on-one interview on the Talking Feds YouTube channel. We're here these few days at the Texas Tribune Festival, which is overflowing with influential figures from politics and journalism. And I'm here with one of them, the influential journalist and author, Rebecca Traister. Rebecca is a prolific author, particularly known for her analyses of politics, gender, and culture, as well as her staunch advocacy for social justice and gender equality. Besides her thought-provoking articles in the New York Times Magazine, The Cut, and The New Yorker, she's written three books, including most recently the New York Times bestseller, Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to talk to you about two broad subjects, both of which are related to what I see as the overarching theme of this conference, which is where do we stand after 8 years of Trumpism and MAGA influence, and what concretely do we have to do to restore our political, legal, and cultural institutions to good health. So let me begin with your recent and very influential article in The Cut entitled The Necessity of Hope. And that's in the context of the post-Dobbs battle to protect reproductive rights. So hope, is the word that really catches attention. You could read it as a sort of, more chin-up, kind of almost simple-minded exhortation, pep talk. I don't think that's, however, how you
certainly
use
not how I
or
intended
define
it.
hope. So can you explain your sense of hope and why you view it as necessary?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here. And absolutely, I'm glad you said that, because I believe that I wrote The Necessity of Hope the afternoon of the Dobbs decision, which, and because of the nature of what I cover, it's not that the Dobbs decision was a surprise. Of course, everybody was just,
Right.
with any Supreme Court decision, you don't know if it's going to be that morning. So, but I absolutely knew it was coming. I was not planning on writing about it. In fact, I told my editors that I wasn't going to.
Why not?
Well, I mean, it's a tangential thing, but I will tell you, I had said when Dobbs was being argued, I told my editors I really didn't want to write about the Dobbs case at all. I didn't want to write about the arguments, which was, had preceded in the fall, I think December of 2021. I'd said I don't want to write about this, and I was having a little bit of a baby temper tantrum about it. It was not a mature choice. But I'm not an abortion beat columnist, right? I'm not on the ground, and I want to make that really clear. But I've been writing about this issue politically, logistically, how abortion is an issue that's tied into so many other crucial policy and political choices that are made. I've written about it personally. I've written about it from every angle for as long as I've been a journalist that I could think of, right? Without overstating that, like, I'm on the ground at clinics. I'm not. There are journalists doing that work, and it's tremendous. That's not the work I do. But I'd written about it in the context of presidential politics, the Supreme Court. I'd done it for so long. And being a journalist who writes about a lot of different things. I also cover the campaign of Hillary Clinton. I write about politicians on state and local levels. I write about movement politics, and I write about abortion. And I can tell you that over the past, 15 or 20 years that I've been writing about abortion, nobody ever wanted to talk about the pieces I wrote about abortion. Nobody wanted to talk about it. So, if I wrote a profile, not even like of Hillary Clinton, but of some, of Susan Collins or Andrew Cuomo, or, I would get invitations to go on cable news, to go on NPR. You do the circuit, right? I wrote books and I did publicity around them. No, but I'd never get those calls about my abortion story. People didn't want to hear about the abortion story. And this was a structural problem. This is part of how we got here. There were a lot of people in a lot of places who did not want to deal with the fact that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned. I'd spent my career writing these pieces and being told that not only was I was being hysterical, I was overstating the case, I was being overdramatic as a single issue person, which I am not, right? I don't see abortion as a single issue at all. And nobody wanted to talk about it.
Even then, because at that point, in my coterie of Supreme Court types, the sky surely was falling.
Of course. If you were paying attention, you knew the sky was falling. Yeah. I mean, if you were paying attention, you knew the sky was falling when Mitch McConnell was refusing to fill the seat, right? if you were paying attention, you knew the sky was falling when the Tea Party came to power, claiming that their agenda was about tax policy and then voting every day to defund Planned Parenthood, right? The sky has been falling for a long time. And my experience of having tried to write about it was that nobody actually wanted to be told the sky was falling and would denigrate those who were trying to say it as being fundamentally over dramatic and hysterical, hyper feminized, single issue whines.
All
okay.
Right, so back to hope.
So I had said when Dobbs was being argued, which I also understood, as I think a lot of people did, this is the form it's going to take, right? It's like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and Ghostbusters. This is the form that this is going to take. Okay. Right. I had told my editors in a sort of baby temper tantrum, it really is an immature thing. I was like, because now everybody's going to want to talk about it and it's too late. Now, I had gone back on that promise even after the Dobbs argument in December, and I had written a column about it. And then the Dobbs decision came, and I found myself thinking about hope, like in a really kind of animal way that day. Again, it wasn't a surprise. It was the opposite of a surprise. But, the sort of outpouring of shock and despair, even after a decision had been leaked, 2 months earlier. There was so much, because we'd been told the sky wasn't falling for so long. There was such shock, how could they do this? How could it be real? Even the people in between the leaked decision and the actual decision saying, no, Roberts is never going to go for it. He's going to take the middle path, which, by the way, was never a middle path. As you know, it was gutting Roe, right? You know that I'm not. Yeah. But that kind of denialism, that don't worry, it's going to be not as bad as you think. And then having it be not only as bad as you think, but also have Clarence Thomas's concurrence saying, also Lawrence, Griswold, Obergefell, right? Those were all mistakes we need to correct. And the sort of shock of it that I was getting from, of course, my phone was ringing off the hook. All these media sources that had never wanted to talk about any abortion coverage before were suddenly like, can you get on the phone? Right? And what happens? What do we do now? How could this have happened? And so I found myself thinking about hope as logistically crucial, truly logistically, not pretty hearts and flowers. Don't worry, it's going to be okay. No, the only way to make it better, to do the work, to actually reverse the horror of what has just been decided today but had been building for decades, is to have hope that you can make change, right? And this applies across many issues. And it's a lesson that I've learned as a journalist. I came into journalism with very little actually education in the history of the stuff that I cover. I had not studied social movements. I hadn't taken what used to be called a women's studies class, now gender studies, when I was an undergraduate. I didn't have background. A lot of this has come from my own. And when I started as a journalist, I covered current events, right? It was like what happened today and maybe what's going to happen tomorrow. And I had to learn a lot of history on my way to writing the books that I've written and writing the articles that I write. And I began to get the longer scope of how progress has been made and then eroded and reversed and then made again, and how the fights are generations in the making, and how there are so many paths to wage the fights, right? That there's political, there's legislative, there's activist, like there's so many different things that have to happen, and they happen over generations. Yeah. And I think a thing that I have noticed, perhaps being born I was born in 1975 at the end of a period of tremendous legal and political change and upheaval in this country, which we've now seen the right wing dedicate the, almost 50 years that I've been alive to reversing, right? There was a sense that things were fixed, right? We changed these things. I was raised on that sense. I was raised, and I think a lot of the people who were so shocked on the day of Dobbs were raised to think we had fixed these things. We fixed voting rights. Obviously, we did not. We fixed abortion. We fixed contraception. We fixed marriage equality. None of those things were fixed. That was a fairy tale we were sold. But so if you've been raised on that fairy tale and absorbed it, what do you do when it's destroyed in front of you? But if you also don't have the history that's been transmitted to you of how long and how many iterations of those fights got us to even that mid-20th century point of being purportedly fixed, right? What does it mean? And I think we've seen from a lot of other writers and thinkers the re-exploration of Reconstruction, for example, right?
Yeah. Boy, Reconstruction seems to come up so often in these last 8 to 10 years. Right?
Precisely because it was another period in which there was this tremendous remaking of the nation. And then it's absolute reversal. And people who were born at a certain point in Reconstruction died. This thing that people now like to say, for example, about abortion, oh, I'm going to die in a country where I have fewer rights than when I was born. This is not unique. This has happened in the United States before. This happened to generations of people who were born in Reconstruction and died at the height of Jim Crow, And I think but we are not taught that history because we are taught a triumphalist version of America's social progress and the changes that have been made. We are taught a very curtailed, like a film strip version of a civil rights movement. We are often not even taught how long it was between the bus boycott and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, let alone, the women who preceded Rosa Parks and refusing to get off the bus. We're not taught about, you may be taught about Seneca Falls in 1848 and that only one person who attended Seneca Falls actually lived to cast a ballot in 1920 after the passage of the 19th Amendment, which we know wasn't even full, that there was another 45 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act that would secure Black women's rights to vote. The scope of what it means to go from 1848 to 1920 to 1965, we're not ever taught that scope of history.
Struggles in real time. It looks like they just happen.
They show the highlight reel, right?
I clerked for Thurgood Marshall, and he, everyone thinks about 1954, but you learned over the course of that year, 30, 40 year ups and downs and overall strategy. And of course, it's right. Okay, but bringing it home now.
So when you experience something like that day of shock, as many millions of people experienced it, they can't believe that this has happened. And that feeling of, wait, a thing I thought was fixed is gone. Well, how do you move forward? Because you can't stand there in stasis and think, it's done, it's over. Because the reality is when you start to think about what it takes, what it could take, the various paths moving forward from this, right? And it's a Supreme Court decision. It's been reversed. And you're looking around, and what do you do to put one foot in front of the other? And that's where hope is a utility. And by the way, my thinking there is actually really influenced by Mariame Kaba, who is a prison industrial complex abolitionist. And that is the notion, she writes about this all the time. Hope is a practice. Hope is a strategy. It's a necessity. And it's not hearts and flowers. It's if you do not believe things can get better, then you're not going to do the work that absolutely has to be done in order to make them better. They're not going to become passively better. No deus ex machina is going to descend from the sky and fix everything that has been broken over the past 50 years and that will be broken in the years to come. We are looking at a lot more losses, potentially.
All right, but let me zero in on the post-Dobbs period where I think, aside from that, how'd you like to play Mrs. Lincoln? But given Dobbs itself, quite a lot has happened in the political ferment over the last year. Were you encountering at the time, or do you feel you're encountering now people who, in fact, are, as you've now described, hopeless? Or did you feel like you were putting your shoulder to the wheel and pushing uphill? Because my sense is of a pretty invigorated movement in the wake of Dobbs.
In the wake of Dobbs. Well, so I think there are a lot of different answers to that question. Yeah. There are absolutely every day I hear from people who say, I can't believe this has happened. What do we do now? And also say a version of, I can't believe my daughters have fewer rights than I had when I was, right? I hear a lot of that. I think it's really important to acknowledge that even under Roe, there were lots of people born who did not have access to those kinds of services, and we've never done a great
color, right?
Absolutely, and that the rights purportedly protected by Roe had been eroded tremendously, even in the past 20 years, depending on what state you were in, via the trap laws and state restrictions. But so I do encounter a lot of that, and then you also have losses like affirmative action, right? You have there are going to be big legal losses moving forward. And there is this sense of it's all being taken away. It is also true that there have been electoral wins that have been unexpected for all kinds of people who prognosticate these things, right? State wins on ballot referenda, midterm wins, right? The midterms was going to be a wipeout for Democrats. And instead, you had that they kept House losses to single digits, which is remarkable, flipped the chambers in Pennsylvania and in Michigan. You saw
Pennsylvania reaffirmed that it's my home state. But that's
Mine
right.
too,
Republicans running scared in many places.
In some places.
The dog who caught the car. Right.
Well, I think both parties are the dogs that caught the car in different ways, because I do think, having written about Democratic politicians for a long time, there is not fluency in terms of how they talk. There's a generation of people who, especially over the past 10 to 15 years, have gotten really good at talking about abortion. In a very, because it's fundamentally authentic to them, but there is a generation, and it's a generation that is still largely in leadership, that still treats it like with enormous fear. And of course, there's a whole battery of consultants who still are fearful about it. They don't know how to talk about it fluently, and so the Democratic Party, speaking broadly, not about individuals who've done Whitmer's a great example. There are state and local legislators all around the country who do this so well, but by and large, the Democratic Party is also the dog that caught the car, because they have an incredibly activated majority that has clearly shown itself, much to their own surprise, willing to vote on this issue. But they don't have the language at hand, because they let the right, the anti-abortion right, over decades gobble up all that language of life and family values and faith, all of which, of course, could truthfully be applied to reproductive rights, healthcare, justice. But the Democratic Party historically doesn't have practice doing that. So they're also
need to, I guess, right?
Well, no, it should have. My argument, I'm very critical of how Democrats have handled abortion for the decades in between Roe and now. But then you also have the Republican Party, which is a dog that caught the car from a different angle, because they got what they wanted, which is wildly unpopular, and they have majorities opposing them in every instance. But they're also tied to a base. I mean, in making a deal around gaining power on opposition to abortion, they built a rabid base that will not let them back away from it. And so they're really caught in a bind as well, because they're not, I mean, this is, both parties are facing terrain that's very unfamiliar to them post Dobbs. And in the meantime, you still have pregnant people bleeding out in parking lots. Yeah. So it's not as though this is an interesting political problem, what's going to happen next? Well, what's happening right now is people are not able to access the care that they need, and we're seeing dire results. Yeah. So,
and actually, this was the one aspect I want to talk, because I think it is distinctive about your work. Tell me if I'm being too facile here, but you're quite attuned to the need for feminism writ large to focus more broadly than on just elite, mainly white and well-to-do women, and this problem is, and has been now since the Hyde Amendment, so much more experienced on the ground by women of color, young women who don't have means. So it seems to me that this aspect, what's really happening on the ground, very much dovetails with an emphasis, with a point you've been making for some time about a need to sort of broaden the scope of feminism today. Is that fair?
It's absolutely fair. And I mean, I take a lot of my thoughts on this have been shaped tremendously by a reproductive justice movement, which is distinct from what was called a reproductive rights movement or the pro-choice movement. Because the reproductive justice movement, led by women of color over decades, has been the one to point out that you can't even, there's a weird thing that happened post-Roe, which is that the pro-choice movement, as they called themselves, was simultaneously super euphemistic, not even using a word abortion, but also monofocused on abortion, right? They didn't want to say the word, but that's fundamentally all it was about. And a reproductive justice movement always pointed out that the notion of choice was meaningless when you're talking about lack of access to all kinds of things that would make any choices about family life, whether that means how good, safe housing, safe schools, criminal justice reform, access to health care of all kinds, that all of these things, access to transportation, right? All the things that we deprive poor people of in this country by the hollowing out over these same 50 years of the social safety net and welfare benefits. And
we're in Texas. There are people who live in Texas who just getting to a state isn't, that where you can have.
And that's true all over the country. Yeah. There are these tremendous deserts in the South. And it's also for people who do want to continue pregnancies, are they going to have safe housing? Are they going to have health care they can get for their kids? Are they going to have access to we have a maternal mortality crisis in this country, which of course is experienced exponentially more by women of color, people of color, and poor people. Are they going to be able to safely deliver wanted pregnancies? There are all these questions before you even get to this question of, do I have choices in this? And that's what I've learned from a reproductive justice movement that has often operated sometimes in tandem with and often critically about the reproductive rights movement. And so, yes, I see all these things as tied together. I don't believe it's possible to silo out one issue. And by the way, something I've learned specifically about abortion advocacy moving forward, if you talk about the so-called green wave in Central and South America, where actually abortion has been decriminalized, most recently in Mexico. In some cases, it's been done by courts. In some cases, it's been done with an electoral component where people had to vote on it. One of the things that I learned in my reporting is that, in fact, people were more likely to vote on abortion when there was a connection made between abortion and the other issues at stake, whether that's, healthcare, climate, democracy, preservation, or reform. To understand abortion is completely woven into the fabric of all these other policy priorities because, of course, as many of us know from lived experience, abortion is woven into our lives, all kinds of questions.
Healthcare providers, a pregnant young woman comes in, there's just a lot to talk about here.
Yes.
And including in places where they're actually banned from saying the A word.
Right.
And yet there's a woman in front of them that presents a panoply of health issues.
I feel like we've gotten very far away from the question of hope, but I'm sorry. I took us on a journey.
No. It's all very good. But I mean, we've used it as a prism into stuff of great current concern. I actually was hoping to move somewhat from your strike zone, if you call it that, to mine.
I might whiff, but we'll try.
Exactly. Good for you for keeping up with sports metaphors. I always feel like I used to cover sports. I like sports fine, but man, pundits like me, they just really over rely on them. That's also far afield. Here is something that's not far afield for me, and for the conference. I think of this conference, which is quite the confab of people and panels, as roughly focused on the notion of is there Trumpism after Trump? What needs to be done other than we're at a crossroads, and should he win, I may move to New Zealand, but we might as well think about the happier possibility that he doesn't. You've said, and it's front and center with what I think about every day, so I wanted to get your thoughts and maybe engage a conversation. In an article from a few months back, The Dangerous Fantasy of Trump's Indictment, I cannot share the pleasures of Trump's arrest, and we could revise that now, of Trump's arrests. It's a hard word to say, isn't it? Arrests. More than that, I'm alarmed by them. Why do you find it alarming?
Well, I've been alarmed by the monofocus on Trump. And that's not to say that what happens to Trump isn't important, right? I don't want to take away from the real, why it is important, these prosecutions and the kind of legal consequences that he might face. For him to not face legal consequences would be dire, okay? So I want to put that out there. But I, as a member of the political media, and, my own sort of social and family networks, I have been alarmed for a really long time before he was elected on the focus on Trump as the problem. Yeah. Because, you asked, will Trumpism continue after Trump, regardless of what happens this coming cycle? I think Trumpism, what we call Trumpism, existed before Trump became a candidate. I associate the far right turn in the party, which he somehow embodied in particularly visible and vulgar ways. He made it all visible, right? But if you were covering the Tea Party and the rise of the Tea Party in 2010, you understood, and there was a willingness on the part of many in the political media to say, no, it's an economic, their priorities are like tax policy and stuff. Well, they were voting to defund Planned Parenthood every day. So they were, if you looked at what was happening in terms of the voter rolls, I noted Brian Kemp is a guest here at the Tribune Festival, right? If you were looking at what was happening in Georgia, if you were looking at what was happening, if you were paying attention to Mitch McConnell and the hard right Republican Party's grab of a Supreme Court seat from a sitting president. A lot of the things that people blame Trump for, like the perversion of the systems, the breakdown of democracy, you can't tell me that that wasn't happening before he was elected president, when the Republican Party was stealing Supreme Court seats from Barack Obama. You can't tell me that that wasn't happening to some degree in 2000 when a Supreme Court decided the election. The Republican Party has been tremendously strategic over a period of decades in a way that the Democratic Party hasn't been. That kind of returning briefly to this question of why hope and why you put one foot in front of the other when it seems like everything is lost. You're looking at a Republican Party that thought a lot was lost in the middle to end of the 20th century and started strategizing in such a brilliant way, taking over every school board, every state legislature, every city council, building a pipeline of judges, strategizing on how to take advantage of the democratic systems that were in place and pervert certain other ones to gain a stranglehold on the courts, on voter rolls, being able to gerrymander districts, being able to gain power either by exploiting the systems that were built to offer power, especially to a sort of capitalist white patriarchal power structure, and breaking the ones that were...
While being a functional minority.
Exactly. Yes, minority rule. Investing in minority rule.
Yeah.
All of that was well underway before Donald Trump descended his golden escalator or whatever he did to announce that he was running for president.
All right. So now bringing that home now to your sense of alarm.
Yes, because what I described earlier in the conversation about the sort of placid belief that we fix things, I believe a lot of the same impulses can be applied to the celebration that people want to feel if Trump is convicted, if he loses. It's not done, right? Because the party whose intentions he made particularly vulgar and visible still wields enormous power in states. Look, we're in Texas right now. I have written about how, for example, abortion as an issue can be used to win elections. We've seen it on ballot referendums in Kentucky and Kansas, places people didn't expect, just most recently in Ohio, Wisconsin. But look at what's happening, for example, in Wisconsin, where there was a massive win for the state Supreme Court judge who was explicit about her intentions around abortion and the voting maps, right? And they're threatening every day to impeach this woman, to literally break democracy. That's a state government in Wisconsin.
Because she made her position clear.
But she won, record turnout, massive win. That is absolutely subverting democracy. Jamel Bouie wrote an incredible column about that in the New York Times. So that's Wisconsin. In Texas, this idea that abortion is winning elections, that's not true here. Look, the things that are happening in Texas, the things that are happening in Florida, and it's certainly not just about abortion. It's about education. It's about book bans. It's about all kinds of new vigilante laws and state travel. Can you travel out of state? They're trying everything. And this is, again, what the Republican Party has been doing for years. And to just look at abortion as an example, they were coming up with all these creative ideas about things that make no medical sense. Can we close down clinics because their hallways aren't wide enough? Yes, they could. Can we force doctors to give misinformation about false links between abortion and breast cancer? Yes, they could do that in states. None of this has to do with Donald Trump. Yeah. It all preceded Donald Trump. He's not actually smart enough to do any of that stuff.
Then none of it would be ameliorated or at least cured by him.
None of it is going to be. It's important. Right. And I worry also as a political reporter who saw the ways in which people who, sort of were ambivalent about or might have distanced themselves from Trump, although nobody's quite brave enough to totally distance themselves from Trump, right? You have the Mitt Romneys, the Susan Collins, right?
On the contrary, all that kind of are craven about
that. But political media, my peers, who are willing to say, oh, Brian Kemp's a real hero because, he wouldn't commit. And I know this is actually, I don't mean to just be parroting Stacey Abrams' line, but it is true. Something she said about him when she was running against him during the midterms was, great, he didn't commit treason. But there was a sense in which anybody who wasn't Trump was a moderate. That is not the case. Brian Kemp is not a moderate. And yet that framing, because we have picked out Trump as some special category of bad, because he's vile and he disgusts us, in some ways, I think he's incredibly valuable in terms of that, because he makes this stuff that is otherwise invisible obvious and undeniable. The racism, the ugliness, the antipathy to others, the open disdain for women, all of that stuff was made more visible by him. But these are tendencies that have informed and motivated his party over decades. And I fear that in thinking that he's the problem and not the party that, he wants again to head, and where he's still running the table. Nobody's gonna win against this guy, right? That's not just special Donald Trump. That's the party. And we have a fantasy that if we get rid of him, we'll solve the problem. And in the meantime, we're making people like Brian Kemp look like the heroes. And he's beating Stacey Abrams. And this is a real pernicious danger moving forward. We cannot, without wanting to take away it is also important to celebrate wins. And I know strategically, talk about hope and the necessity of hope. You also have to take moments when there are wins, whether they're small, whether they're right, to say, look at what we just did, and it doesn't solve the whole problem, but it's a good thing, and we want to feel good because we don't want our lifetimes given to fighting, fascism, autocracy, whatever you want to say, to be these endless slogs of misery and having to grasp for hope in dark places. No, when you have wins, you want to feel good. So I don't want to discourage people from feeling like this is terrific if a person who has, committed terrible sins against democracy is held legally accountable. Great. We should feel good about that. But what we don't want to get lulled into, because we're all so scared, is thinking that we made the threat go away if we get rid of this one guy. He is not the whole threat. That's where I come into that.
All right. So I think I understand very well then exactly what you mean. Such a pleasure talking to you. I've wanted to do it for a while. I hope you'll come back.
I will.
The things we're talking about are
They're not going away.
No. But I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.